Ladies and gentlemen, on the other side, we're now going to be joined by Nabil Zoldjalali, who's going to be talking on the topic Weathering the Storm, the Challenges of Securing Cloud and SaaS Applications. Well, Nabil, the Director of Cloud Security, Darktrace Toronto, he's somebody who specializes in the application of cloud technologies and works closely with Darktrace research and development team. He advises the strategic Fortune 500 customers from North America on advanced threat detection, cyber AI, and autonomous response for cloud and SaaS environments. Thank you so much, Nabil, for joining us today. Over to you.
Hi there. My name is Nabil Zoldjalali, and I'm the Director of Cloud Security here at Darktrace. And today I really want to focus on cloud and SaaS security. It's been a very, very hot topic in the last few months. And I really want to kind of highlight some of the really interesting applications of how cyber AI can really help defend and protect against those environments. Now, if you look at kind of the really high level trends of what we're seeing with cloud and SaaS adoption, there's really been a massive explosion. And SaaS has really become the de facto technology for collaboration and communication. And we're seeing a massive shift to cloud. Some of these really high level stats show things like, 90% of companies are using cloud computing. Cloud data centers processing north of 94% of workloads in 2021. But what's really interesting is that with this kind of complex and hybrid multi-cloud infrastructure becoming an essential part of increasingly diverse digital estates, the journey to the cloud has fundamentally reshaped the traditional paradigm of the network perimeter while expanding the attack surface at an alarming rate. Traditional security tools that only offer point solutions, they usually rely on a retrospective set of rules or known threats. And these tools are fundamentally shown to be really ill-equipped to stop novel and advanced attacks. As the entire business is shifting and it's becoming more and more dynamic, it's becoming increasingly complex to actually secure that. And I actually want to dig into this a little bit deeper, right? With this whole shift to dynamic work, the dynamic workforce has actually shown a few really interesting trends. The first, that digital transformation projects are absolutely blowing up. I think, the CEO of Microsoft said it best, we've done 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. And the reality is that today's workforce, it's dispersed, it's dynamic, it's fundamentally unpredictable. It's making it really harder and harder for security teams to keep track of what devices are doing on the quote unquote corporate network, right? How are users operating with SaaS applications? What's the level of data coming in and out? And really what's interesting is that the kind of line between work and personal life is becoming incredibly murky. I know there was a recent Wall Street Journal article that was talking about how, given the new normal, there are actually a lot of employees that can oftentimes confuse work from personal life. A lot of people might be using their laptops and maybe inadvertently doing some online shopping during their lunch hour, during a lull in work. And these are really low-hanging fruit for cyber criminals, right? They love this kind of rapid change and unexpected adoption of new tools and technologies. It's really what they thrive off of. And kind of looking at this, it's really important to kind of quantify how much are companies these days using new tools and technologies. And it's really been astronomical. I mean, we're seeing things like Microsoft Teams increasing their daily users by 270%. Zoom going from 10 million users to over 200 million. And it's really these kinds of adoptions where if you look at them, you easily notice that this is massive increase in terms of what we're normally used to. These software seats are just flying off the shelves. And with that comes a really, really high dependency on the people that set up these systems. And it becomes incredibly important to do this correctly and make sure that you don't compromise any of the security that you're used to seeing. So looking at that lack of visibility and understanding and familiarity, one thing I do want to talk about is, what is the industry saying, right? If you look at an aggregate of all the companies out there being surveyed, right, what is the general census on how people feel from a security perspective? And to do this, I actually wanted to highlight some really interesting stats that came up in a recent Cybersecurity Insiders report. It was the 2020 Insider Threat Report. And it was actually a really interesting survey because they actually polled over 400,000 subscribers in a variety of different industries, including technology, government, and financial services. And as you can see here, the largest portion of the respondents, in this case 36% of them, they actually said that since migrating to the cloud, detecting insider threats are at least somewhat harder. 17% said detecting insider threats is now significantly harder. So that really those two top tiers combined for over half of how businesses are feeling these days. And what's really, really interesting is that if you compare this to what normally used to happen, right, with the normal network and on-prem tools and data centers and all the rest. Another one of the kind of key questions was, do organizations monitor abnormal cloud use in general? Right? And you can see that 44% of organizations do not monitor any type of abnormal user behavior across their entire cloud infrastructure. And these are stats in comparison to what we normally see. Right? So that 53% of people that find it harder to find insider threat, that's 53% that are finding it harder than detecting insider threats in normal networks. And detecting insider threat in normal networks is already incredibly difficult, right? So really, these are incredibly difficult challenges that security teams have to face. How do you protect a business when, for starters, the business is dynamic and continuously changing and evolving? As a second point, you can't really detect how those changes and adoptions are going to look like in the long term. And three, you have attackers that are using novel approaches that we've never seen before. How do you protect and secure an organization where you can't tell what the attacker is going to do next, and you can't exactly put your finger, have a pulse of what your own business is looking like right now from an infrastructure or SaaS perspective? And this is actually a really interesting question because it forces us to look at the approach, right? The approach of using stagnant rules or signatures to really detect, known malicious behaviors really crumbles in this type of scenario. So we need to look at another approach that might really shine in this specific context. And for that, I really wanted to highlight a beautiful parallel that we see to this in nature, which is our own human immune systems. When human beings are born, they're not born with a database of every known type of malicious cancer or autoimmune disease they can get. They don't even know what every strand of the influenza looks like for them. But what they are born with is an immune system that learns very accurately what their body's compositions are, that really understands the identity of the individual and can very accurately detect anything that's not part of that person. And once it detects it, it deals with it, it kills it, it attacks it, and it makes sure that the only thing that's running inside your body is what is supposedly you yourself. And from that perspective, it becomes really interesting because applying this same type of approach to businesses has never proved more valuable, right? Being able to extract a whole slew of data from across the business, whether it's SaaS API logs, whether it's infrastructure in cloud services, whether it's platform as a service, it doesn't really matter. Being able to digest all that information and understand what normal looks like, whether that's through a slew of serverless deployments, whether that's Docker and Kubernetes clusters, and taking that information and then being able to very, very accurately pinpoint what sticks out as something that's novel, never seen before, that doesn't really fit the build of the business itself. These behavioral models have been so good at not only detecting things that we haven't seen in the past, but they've been incredibly accurate with actually adapting to this new way of dynamic work. Being able to identify the really interesting shifts that don't fit into the kind of norm of a business. And I'm talking beyond just, time of day or amount of data, but looking at the holistic context and understanding what doesn't fit has really allowed customers of Darktrace to go above and beyond, right? To identify all sorts of interesting threats before any type of proper classification or assumption of good and bad comes to place. And what's really, really interesting from my perspective is if you could prove this out properly, if you could accurately and precisely detect deviations from norm that aren't just interesting behavioral anomalies, but truly security related and contextualized threats to a business, the perfect proof of how accurate those detections are and how solid their validity is really comes in the question of what can you do with it. If you could truly detect cloud infrastructure that's being compromised or a user's account that's been taken over, and you could do it accurately and precisely 10 times out of 10, then the best way to prove that is to actually add to it response. And this is really where Darktrace actually brought in a huge shift in terms of the way we actually go about security, being able to take autonomous surgical action without the need to define what it is exactly that you're defending against or what exactly the response should be. For the longest time, security teams have had to really define accurately what the playbook is, how we respond to different types of threats, knowing what those threats are and knowing what the response should be. But with the advent of autonomous response, this has actually really allowed us to take this idea of an immune system and fully apply it across the entire business, right? Self-learning AI and autonomous response is allowing organizations to embrace rapid digital transformation, but it's also allowing them to enhance visibility across their entire digital estate, from cloud to SaaS. And it's really what allows Darktrace to understand the way users interact as opposed to dictating it. And just to kind of really bring this point home, if you could properly understand what a user's behavior normally looks like, and you could detect the anomalies that are so far outside the realm of normal that they shouldn't be happening in the first place, not only can you detect and take surgical action, but you could actually enforce the normal pattern of life for the business. Meaning that regardless of what's going on, whether it's a low and slow attack or an incredibly fast moving attack, you can actually enforce normal and actually enforce the network to behave the way it normally does without necessarily needing to define all the things that you're supposed to stop. And this actually being able to kind of self-generate and self-improve autonomous response has been an absolute game changer in terms of allowing security teams to at least catch up with the attackers at hand. Some examples of this, some of my favorite examples are things like data exfiltration. Being able to detect the fact that data is leaving a business, but not only to detect it and hope that someone sees the alert and actions it, but also respond, stopping that exfiltration of data and allowing people to actually catch up so that you're actually decreasing the blast radius. A few other examples that I think are incredibly prevalent these days, compromised credentials, as well as cryptojacking, where attackers love to actually take over infrastructure and actually use it to mine cryptocurrency. So what's been really interesting is that really leveraging some very sophisticated AI to not only to detect, but also to respond has allowed security teams now to catch up with the speed of attackers. But there's been one challenge that security teams face day in and day out that we still haven't talked about, and that's the actual investigation. Right? At the end of the day, someone's going to have to look at an alert and make sense of what they're seeing. Make sense of the context, try to understand the backstory. And what we've found is over the last 3.5 years at Darktrace, we've gone on this incredible research project to actually try to capture some of that kind of level 1 investigation and actually give that some of that to the AI. So to do that, what we've done is we've monitored and modeled our own internal security analysts with their permission. We've actually seen how they use our own tools for customers to be able to actually augment them to a certain extent. So over the last 3.5 years, we've built out this massive data lake of how users use Darktrace. And we've actually been able to automate some of that investigation with the creation of the Cyber AI Analyst. And this has been absolutely incredible. Being able to combine human expertise with the speed and scale of AI has actually shown some really interesting results. One thing I really want to highlight here is the fact that given that it's software, it can actually go through multiple parallel threads of investigations at machine speed. It can find where behavioral anomalies correlate with each other, and it could do this cohesively and completely without any type of human impairment. And there's no stress that affects the software. It doesn't feel, the burden of time or deadlines. The software is able to do this iteratively over and over and over again, and actually be able to find and prioritize what security teams should be looking at, reducing the triage time to up to 92%. This has been, I think, one of the most valuable things that Darktrace has given the security industry these days, and we continue to receive incredible feedback from it. But one thing I really want to talk about is looking at some of this stuff in real life. I think in theory, a lot of times, very seldom do I get people that maybe disagree or don't really understand the theory behind some of this technology, but it's really incredible to kind of see this in action and what it brings to the table. So I wanted to cover some case studies to really go over that. And this first case study is something that I find quite often with different types of cloud architects and cloud teams. We actually detected a very subtle mistake that a junior DevOps engineer was actually making. This was going on at a multinational organization, and they actually had workloads across AWS and Azure, and they were pretty far along their cloud journey. They were, leveraging containerized systems, Docker and Kubernetes and so on. What ended up happening was that the engineer had actually accidentally downloaded a phony update. And that update had actually built into it a crypto miner, which led to actual severe infections across a variety of different cloud production systems. But what's really interesting here is after the initial infection, the malware immediately started beaconing out to command and control servers externally, and that behaviorally was something that has never been seen before. And as soon as those connections get established, the attacker sends the attack mission instructions, and the tools start actually mining for cryptocurrency and downloading all the relevant packages required. And again, those behaviorally stick out and don't happen. But the reason I've brought this specific case study into the presentation is I really want to focus on the timescales. The actual attack was able to go across 20 different EC2 instances in under 15 seconds. And this is, I think, the most perplexing aspect of cloud security. And one of the main reasons I always urge security teams to consider not only the preventative aspect of cloud security, which, don't get me wrong, is incredibly important, but to really look at detection and response and understand the criticality, given the fact that with cloud environments, the entire time scale of attacks becomes incredibly condensed. I know historically speaking, we talk about different types of ransomware or malware, even cryptocurrency campaigns in the scale of days or weeks or even months sometimes. But now we're actually seeing these same campaigns run in the time scale of seconds. And this before has never been seen. So it's becoming more and more critical to be able to not only detect these types of behaviors, and not only hold them back so they don't progress, but to also provide the autonomous investigation so that security teams really have all the tools they need to actually help the business continue to run. Now, speaking of actual differences between cloud and kind of network security in general, one thing that I also see oftentimes is mistakes that are very innocent mistakes that arise from just a lack of familiarity. And what arises from that sometimes can be incredibly costly to organizations. This next case study was actually an insurance group. And what we actually saw was a DevOps engineer who was following all the best practices to the T. They were actually attempting to build a parallel backup system within AWS to replicate the company's data and actually send that replication or send that duplicate to a data center to actually keep for themselves. And this kind of backup was supposed to run once a month. Relatively standard, just to make sure, in case anything ever goes wrong, you're kind of covering all your bases. And again, the technical implementation was absolutely perfect. Backup systems were created, but the only issue that came up was that they were actually set up to pull backups every day as opposed to once a month. And that was actually starting to cause an incredible amount of data leaving their cloud environment and going to their networks that the business had never seen before and wasn't able to understand. These types of mistakes, if they go untended, could cost several millions of dollars per year. And oftentimes they happen with the actual end users completely unaware until it's too late, until that bill comes and you have no choice but to build it. But being able to detect these types of things in real time, again, it really gives a holistic understanding of the business to the security team and allows them to operate incredibly efficiently. So to summarize, the entire shift to dynamic work has really profoundly impacted the way we go about security. What we've seen time and time again is cyber AI really showing that the behavioral approach is a perfect complement to what most people are very familiar and used to, and able to actually go the extra mile and detect against a variety of different and dynamic mishaps and attacks that normally would go undetected. So with that, I'll wrap up. I thank you all for your time. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at info@darktrace.com. Thanks.